The coronavirus has really changed our Christmas traditions this year, hasn't it? Family gatherings and holiday activities have either been downsized or maybe in some cases totally eliminated. Maybe you've had to do something like we did. We had our virtual Christmas with a part of our family who lives in North Carolina via video phone. We watched our 2-year-old grandson unwrap and then play with the presents that we sent him for Christmas. And while it was nice having the technology, it just wasn't the same. There obviously was something missing. Visits with mall Santa Clauses this year have either been discontinued or socially distanced. And apparently thousands of children are breathing a sigh of relief for that, because a Santa Claus is frightening to many of them. A couple of pictures of examples. Maybe you've witnessed this as you walked through a mall or stood in line, or maybe your own child had an experience like that sitting on Santa's lap. To be quite honest, some Santas frighten me as well. There's the creepy Santa Claus and the barroom fight Santa Claus. Don't let your children sit on laps like those. Some Santas seem to enjoy instilling fear in children, as this next photo indicates, while others have a few fears of their own to deal with, as wet children have to sit on their knee. We don't usually associate fear with Christmas, do we? It's a happy time in our mind. We have these beautiful images both in our mind and out in front of our eyes of a baby in a manger and angels singing in the sky and shepherds running to Bethlehem with excitement and worshiping dignitaries falling at his feet. Those images all come to us from Matthew and Luke's accounts of the Christmas story. But have you ever read the Christmas story according to St. John? I don't mean from the Gospel of John, chapter 1, the pre-existent Jesus. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Very heavy theological stuff. And there's a Christmas story in there, a Christmas message in there. But what I'm referring to is the Christmas story that John tells in the Revelation of John, in Revelation chapter 12. And he employs a few images of his own, but they're different images. They're images of war and fear and violence and a devouring dragon. You never expected the dragon to be a part of a Christmas story, did you? But in John's, it is. Just like with Matthew and Luke, John's Christmas story is one of a birth. Let's begin to read together from Revelation 12, the first 2 verses. A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. It's the image of a glorious birth that John paints for us. The mother is described with symbols that represent both dominion and splendor. She is clothed with the sun. The moon is under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars grace her head. It isn't Mary that John is describing, that humble peasant girl of Luke's gospel. So who is the mother in this Christmas story according to John? There are a few clues for us in the text. It tells us that on her head was this crown with 12 stars in it. The number 12 is significant in the Bible. It's the number that represents God's people, both in the Old Testament, the 12 tribes of Israel, and in the New Testament, the 12 disciples. So the number 12 represents God's people. This woman represents, therefore, the people of God. And then John borrows an image from a prophecy made by Jeremiah, from Jeremiah 4:31, when he wrote, I heard a cry as of a woman in labor, anguish as one giving birth to her first child, the cry of the daughter of Zion. Here Jeremiah depicts the nation of Israel as an expectant mother, and John borrows that imagery for his Christmas story. And so John is indicating for us that the woman in his Christmas story is the nation of Israel, the nation which produced or gave birth to the Messiah. In verse 5 of John's story, he borrows again, this time, messianic terminology from the Old Testament to describe the son born to this woman. She gave birth to a son, a male child, who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter. And her child was snatched up to God and to his throne. And so John's is a Christmas story with Israel as the mother, giving birth to the Messiah. And that's not inaccurate in the symbolism that he portrays. It's a glorious birth that he depicts for us, but it's also an inglorious birth. For his is not the peaceful story of an oh holy night on which all is calm in the little town of Bethlehem while angels sang glory to the newborn king. No. In John's Christmas story, there was pain and fear and death. But that was also predicted when Jesus was born. His parents took him to the temple for his dedication, just a few days old. One of the attendants on duty was a man by the name of Simeon, and Simeon made that prediction about Jesus. We read it in Luke chapter 2, verses 34 and 35. Simeon blessed them and said to Mary, his mother, "This child is destined to cause the falling and rising of many in Israel, and to be a sign that will be spoken against, so that the thoughts of many hearts will be revealed. And a sword will pierce your own soul too." You see, the birth of Jesus was for a violent purpose. He was born to die. Romans 8:3 tells us, God, sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh and as a offering for sin, condemned sin in the flesh. Jesus was in fact born to be slaughtered like a sacrificial animal, a sin offering made for us. And so we're beginning to see that while John's Christmas story is a story about a birth, it is also a story involving conflict. The fearsome beast was present, as we see in verses 3 and 4 as we go on to John's story. Then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on its heads. Its tail swept 1/3 of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth so that it might devour her child the moment it was born. Yow. That's a Christmas story? A dragon? A mythical creature which symbolized danger? There are similar symbols in the Old Testament about dangerous supernatural creatures, sometimes referred to as sea monsters, sometimes as serpents, as we see in Isaiah 27, verse 1. In that day the Lord will take his terrible swift sword and punish Leviathan, the swiftly moving serpent, the coiling, writhing serpent. He will kill the dragon of the sea. And John used that image in his Christmas story. In John's story, the dragon had many heads, symbolic of increased danger. In his story, the dragon had many horns, symbolic of great power. And the dragon had many crowns, which was a symbol of rule and dominion. John paints a picture for us of a terrible, fearsome, powerful beast. That's not the Christmas story we envision. Have you ever received a Christmas card like this one? Whoa. Have you ever seen a manger scene like this? No. A dragon loomed over the birthplace of Christ. Who or what was that dragon? John tells us plainly in his Christmas story in verse 9, when he wrote, "The great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. He was hurled to the earth, and his angels with him." This was, you see, a part of a great spiritual war. Satan had invaded our world. The dragon spread his wings, flames bellowing from his lungs. For Jesus was born to defeat him. And so knowing that, Satan attempted to destroy the Christ child when he was most vulnerable. And in that little town of Bethlehem, a terrible dragon swooped in to swallow the child who came to liberate us. Hark, the herald angels sing, "A dragon waits to eat our king." Philip Yancey wrote, "Christmas signals far more than the birth of a baby. It was an invasion, the decisive advance in a great struggle for the cosmos." Satan led a war in heaven, you see. He had recruited about a third of the angels in rebellion against God, attempting to usurp the throne from God. But Satan and his army were defeated. They were cast out of heaven and cast down to earth. And John tells us that in his continuing Christmas story as we return to it in verse 7. "Then war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. But he was not strong enough, and they lost their place in heaven. The great dragon was hurled down. He was hurled to the earth, and his angels with him." And so his mission became to destroy the work of God, specifically in the life of God's Messiah. But God preserved that child, as we saw in verse 5. Therefore, a more fearful battle ensued. And John tells us about that in verses 10 through 12 of his Christmas story. "I heard a loud voice in heaven say, 'Now have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Messiah. For the accuser of our brothers and sisters, who accuses them before our God day and night, has been hurled down. But woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has gone down to you. He is filled with fury because he knows that his time is short.'" When Satan could not win a battle in heaven, he established a new battleground, this world. And his intentions, his motive, his plan of action is still the same. He still attempts to destroy the work of God. Verse 13 tells us, "When the dragon saw that he had been hurled to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child." In this verse, the symbolism shifts slightly. The woman still represents the people of God, but now under the new covenant, it's the church. While before, under the old covenant, it was the nation of Israel, the Jewish people. The woman is God's church, and Satan attacks her. And yet God will protect her from those attacks, as verses 15 and 16 tell us. "Then from his mouth the serpent spewed water like a river to overtake the woman and sweep her away with a torrent. But the earth helped the woman by opening its mouth and swallowing the river that the dragon had spewed out of his mouth." Satan uses any means possible to attempt to destroy the church. Sometimes he strikes at the peace of the church, causing personality conflicts and power struggles. Sometimes Satan strikes at the unity of a church by sowing seeds of discontent and division. Sometimes he strikes at the integrity of a church by leading its members into sin. Sometimes he strikes at the joy of a church by stirring criticism and promoting disillusionment. And most recently, I believe, Satan has attempted to strike at the vitality of the church by causing a pandemic to dislodge many of its members from it. But God always protects his church from destruction. History has proven that. The church has withstood the attacks of Satan in every century. It survived the attack of the Jewish religious leaders in the first century, and it survived the attack of the Roman Empire in the second and third century. The church survived the attack of Islam in medieval times. It has survived the attack of liberalism in the 19th century and communism in the 20th century, and so far is surviving the attack of secularism in this current century. Oh, the church has been wounded at times, and maybe even damaged, but never destroyed. However, John warns us in his Christmas story that the battle will continue. However, Satan will change his tactics. He first attempted to destroy the woman who was going to give birth to the Messiah, the nation of Israel, but God preserved her. And then he tried to destroy the Messiah, but God preserved the Messiah. Then he tried to destroy the church, but God providentially protected the church. And so Satan changes his tactics, as verse 17 tells us. Then the dragon was enraged at the woman and went off to wage war against the rest of her offspring, those who keep God's commands and hold fast their testimony about Jesus. He now makes his attacks on individual Christians, the offspring of the church. It's the only battle Satan can win. He will attempt to destroy you. He will attempt to destroy you through temptation to sin and through trials that weaken your faith. He will attempt to destroy you through an apathy which makes your faith seem irrelevant at times. He will attempt to destroy you with an egotism which puts your will ahead of God's. And Satan will attempt to destroy you through a busyness that just simply crowds God out of your life. And God will not prevent those attacks. You might have noticed as we read through the scripture in this story that John tells that consistently there is the promise of God's protection against Satan's destructions in every case, except for one. Verse 5 told us that he preserved his child, his son. Verse 6 tells us that he protected the woman Israel. Verse 16 tells us that he promises his continuing protection of the church, but no such promise follows the warning of Satan's attack on individual Christians. That is because something can interrupt God's protective custody of us, and it is our will. You see, God does not violate our freedom to choose, even if he knows we will choose wrong. We can will ourselves, therefore, to refuse being obedient to God. We can will ourselves to disregard biblical teaching and morality. We can will ourselves to avoid God's church and service in his kingdom. We can will ourselves to ignore God's call on our life. Oh, there will be a price to pay, but we can do it. It's our choice. But God will not violate that freedom. However, if we do so, if we choose that path, we make ourselves vulnerable to the dragon's attacks. Some Christians will not heed this warning that John gives us in his Christmas story. Some will not go to any lengths to protect themselves. They will not make their spiritual welfare a priority, and therefore they will be weak and susceptible. Satan missed his opportunity in Bethlehem, so he followed that child, watching, waiting. He hounded Jesus with temptations and accusations and betrayal, until finally on the cross, Satan seemed to win. But the cross was not Jesus' greatest defeat. It was his greatest victory. For he won eternal liberation for us there on the cross. Jesus became the dragon slayer. And so we are safe. But we are safe only in a relationship of faith and obedience to Christ. And so I would encourage you to embrace faith in Jesus and to commit to follow him and to find refuge in his church, which has his providential protection. And if you do, you will have nothing to fear. And even this fearful Christmas story will have a happy ending for you.